The kitchen was loud with clattering pans, and the smell of fresh bread when a cry cut through the air. Not from the oven, but from a baby left restless in the corner. The single dad chef, sleeves rolled up and heart worn thin, set down his knife and scooped the child into his arms. He had fed hungry strangers before, but never a baby who wasn't his own. Gently, he stirred a simple recipe, one born of love more than skill, and fed her spoon by spoon until the tears quieted. But when the child's mother arrived, a billionaire used to silver spoons and crystal glasses, she froze. One taste of his humble dish, and the tears she had hidden from the world for years began to fall. The scent of warm bread had always been his refuge, the one thing that reminded him life could still hold comfort, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. For Daniel, the single dad chef, the kitchen was more than a workplace, it was the only place where his tired heart felt steady. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed on the street. His clothes were plain, his hands worn from years of chopping, kneading, scrubbing, and lifting pots heavier than his own little daughter. But behind the quiet strength in his shoulders was a story of sacrifice, one he rarely told. He had once dreamed of being a celebrated chef in a fine restaurant, serving plates dressed like art. But that dream was shelved the day his wife walked away, leaving him with a newborn child and no choice but to figure life out one meal at a time. The early years were brutal. He worked odd jobs in kitchens that paid him scraps, rushing between babysitters and double shifts, barely keeping the lights on. There were nights he fell asleep at the stove while a pot simmered, his daughter curled in a blanket beside him on the kitchen floor, because he couldn't afford a crib and still buy groceries. The only thing that kept him going was her laughter, small and sweet, a reminder that she depended on him alone. Every recipe he crafted wasn't about perfection or presentation, it was about survival, about making something nourishing out of almost nothing. He learned how to stretch ingredients, how to create flavor from scraps, how to make food that warmed the soul. That was the essence of his cooking, not Michelin stars, but love measured in every spoonful. By the time he opened his small corner café, Daniel had become a man defined by quiet resilience. His regulars came not because of fancy menace but because his food carried a tenderness that couldn't be faked. He fed them like family, asking about their days, remembering their stories, slipping an extra cookie into a paper bag for a child who looked too tired to smile. And yet, beneath all the strength and kindness, there was exhaustion he never admitted. Raising his daughter alone meant every smile he gave the world cost him something unseen. But he would never let anyone notice the weight he carried. His pride wasn't in what he owned, but in the fact that his little girl never went hungry, never felt abandoned, and never doubted that her father's love was enough to fill the gaps life had left. That afternoon, the café was buzzing with clattering pans and murmurs of customers when a sound pierced through the air that made Daniel freeze. It was the sound of a baby crying, raw and unfiltered, the kind of cry that shook even the busiest heart. He looked up from his chopping board and saw her, small, red-faced, fists clenched, tears streaming. The baby sat in a carrier on the floor near the corner, clearly left in a rush by someone who had dashed to the counter. She was wailing with a desperation that Daniel recognized all too well, the sound of hunger. He had heard it in his own daughter years ago, when he'd run out of formula and paced the room with helpless tears of his own. Something inside him cracked open. Without a second thought, he set down his knife, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked over. Customers turned their heads, curious, but Daniel wasn't thinking about anyone else. He knelt down, scooping the baby into his arms with the practiced ease of a man who had once rocked a screaming infant night after night until his arms ached. Her small body trembled against his chest, her tiny mouth rooting against his shirt. Hunger, he thought again, a pain no child should endure. He carried her into the kitchen, ignoring the stares and whispers. His café was built on feeding whoever needed it, and today, that meant starting with the smallest soul in the room. He scanned the shelves quickly, pulling down a small pot, some fresh vegetables, and the kind of broth he always kept simmering for quick meals. His daughter, now 6, peeked in from the back room where she had been drawing. "Daddy, is she hungry?" she asked softly, sensing the weight of the moment. He nodded, offering her a reassuring smile even as his heart raced. "She just needs a little love in her tummy," he murmured. His daughter returned to her crayons. trusting him the way only a child who had seen her father fix everything could. Daniel worked quickly, holding the baby close in one arm, while stirring with the other, balancing as if he had done it 100 times before. The recipe wasn't anything fancy, just soft vegetables, a hint of spice, a broth that smelled like comfort itself. But it was made with the instinct of a man who knew exactly how to cook for the fragile, the tired, and the broken. He cooled the mixture carefully, mashing it into a smooth texture, then took a tiny spoonful and brought it to her lips. The baby wailed, turned her head, then hesitated as the taste touched her tongue. A moment later, she swallowed, and the crying softened into curious quiet. Spoon after spoon, she ate, her little fists unclenching as calm replaced the storm. The cafe had gone silent, watching the single dad chef cradle a stranger's child and feed her as if she were his own. No one spoke, because in that moment, they understood something sacred was happening. As he fed her, Daniel's mind wandered back to nights when his own baby had clung to him for life. Nights when he thought he would break under the weight of it all, only to find that a simple act, a meal, a lullaby, a whispered promise, was enough to carry them both forward. He knew nothing about this child's story, who her mother was, or why she had been left in his cafe that afternoon. All he knew was that no baby deserved to cry from hunger, and no parent should feel alone in trying to feed their child. For him, food had always been more than sustenance. It was proof that love could be tangible, that care could be stirred into a pot and poured into someone's life. By the time the baby's mother returned, the wails were gone, replaced with the soft, sleepy sighs of a full stomach. Daniel didn't look up immediately when she entered. He was too focused on wiping the corner of the baby's mouth, rocking her gently as she settled against his shoulder. To him, it didn't matter who she belonged to, whether her family was rich or poor, known or unknown. In that moment, she was simply a child who needed to be fed, and he was a father who knew how to give. She had built an empire out of silence. Every boardroom she entered fell quiet, every headline spoke of her brilliance, and every glance reminded the world she was untouchable. Veronica Hale, billionaire, visionary, a woman sculpted by ambition, was known for power that glittered like steel. But behind the polished glass of her towers, behind the gowns and diamonds and chauffeured cars, she lived in a solitude so sharp it cut her breath at night. Money had made her unbreakable in the eyes of strangers, but it had not taught her how to hold a baby when the crying wouldn't stop, nor how to whisper comfort into the ears of a child who needed warmth more than wealth. That afternoon, she had stepped into the small cafe only because desperation had left her no choice. Her meetings had stretched long, her schedule was a storm, and her infant daughter had grown restless in the car. She thought she could order something quickly, keep the baby soothed long enough to escape. But exhaustion had betrayed her. She had turned her back for only a moment, and when she returned, the child was gone from the corner where she had set the carrier. Panic hit her like ice in her veins. She rushed past the tables, breath sharp, until her eyes landed on the kitchen doorway. There, she saw him, the man in a flour-stained apron, sleeves rolled, cradling her daughter as if she had always belonged in his arms. Her first instinct was to shout, to demand, to reclaim what was hers. But then she stopped. The scene before her disarmed her more than any hostile takeover or legal battle ever had. The baby who had been sobbing, the baby she could not calm no matter how many toys or high-end formula she bought, was quiet. The stranger held her with a tenderness Veronica hadn't seen since her own mother had died years ago. Back when life was still simple, back when she had known what love looked like without contracts or negotiations. He sat there, rocking gently, feeding her with a spoon as if each bite mattered more than anything in the world. And the baby, her baby, looked at him not with fear, but with trust. Veronica felt something crack inside her chest. She had always been so careful to shield her emotions, to never let anyone see her falter. But standing in that humble cafe, surrounded by the smell of broth and bread, she felt stripped of every layer of armor. Her throat tightened, her hands trembled, and she blinked rapidly as if sheer will could stop the sting in her eyes. It didn't. Tears she had not shed in years began to blur her vision. She pressed her lips together, but they quivered anyway. The sight of her child, soothed by a stranger's hands, broke through the iron cage around her heart. He didn't notice her right away. He was focused on the baby, wiping her chin, whispering softly, rocking as if the world outside didn't exist. It wasn't a performance, she realized. It wasn't for her benefit or for anyone watching. It was simply what he knew to do. A man who had learned the language of survival, a father who knew how to make love tangible through food and patience, was now offering it to her child, and it humbled her in a way billions never could. When he finally looked up, his gaze met hers. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't even curious, it was steady, kind, almost apologetic, as if to say, she was crying and I couldn't just stand by. Veronica's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the worn tiles, until she stood at the counter separating them. She reached out instinctively, then stopped when she saw her daughter's tiny hand gripping his apron, as if unwilling to let go. Her vision blurred again, and this time, she let the tears fall. She had not cried in front of another person since she was a teenager, not since the night she vowed she would never be weak again. Yet here she was, a billionaire mother undone by the sight of her daughter eating a humble recipe in the arms of a man who lived in a world so far from her own. She asked him, almost in a whisper, what he had fed her. His answer was simple, just a broth, some vegetables, nothing special. But she knew better. She could smell it from where she stood. It wasn't wealth that flavored that dish. It was memory, care, patience. It was love, and it tasted like something she had lost long ago. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, before the fortune, before the losses. She remembered her mother's kitchen, the smell of stew simmering on a rainy evening, her father humming softly in the background. She remembered the warmth of being fed without pretense, without the perfection of chefs, or the sterility of silver platters. It was food that carried stories. Food that meant you belonged. She hadn't tasted that in decades, hadn't let herself even yearn for it, because yearning required admitting she lacked something. But now, with a single bite her daughter had swallowed, those walls had crumbled, and the ache of longing surged through her like fire. She stepped around the counter without asking, her heart moving her faster than her mind. The man didn't flinch as she approached. He simply looked at her with the quiet patience of someone who had seen exhaustion before. She took the spoon from his hand, hesitated, then tasted what remained in the pot. The first spoonful hit her tongue, and she closed her eyes. It was as if time reversed, pulling her back to her mother's embrace, to nights when life was simple, and love wasn't so hard to hold on to. The salt of the broth mingled with the salt of her tears, and she let herself weep silently, spoon clutched in her hand. She felt ashamed, not because of the man or the café, but because of what the moment revealed about her. All the wealth, all the power, and she had forgotten the very essence of what it meant to nurture. She could buy the finest formula, hire the best nannies, but she had never slowed down long enough to simply feed her child with her own hands, to let food be more than sustenance. To let it be love. And here was this man, a stranger, showing her the truth she had buried beneath layers of ambition. Her daughter stirred gently, drowsy and satisfied, resting against the chef's chest as if she had known him forever. Veronica reached out again, and this time, her hand touched her child's cheek. She felt warmth, steadiness, security. Her daughter turned slightly, nuzzling against her palm, and Veronica broke again into tears. For the first time in years, she whispered softly, almost to herself, "I don't know how to do this." Her voice cracked, vulnerable and raw. The chef didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted the baby in his arms and offered her a look that carried no judgment, only understanding. When he finally spoke, his words were gentle, simple, but they landed with the force of truth. "You don't need to know everything. You just need to be here." And for the first time in her empire, built life, Veronica believed it.